2/3 of Americans now say the other political party is not just wrong, but a serious threat to the United States itself. Trust in the government has collapsed to just 22%, which is near historic lows. The middle class, the glue that holds this country together, has been absolutely hollowed out. Housing is now at its least affordable point in 30 years, locking young Americans out of the only asset they intuitively understand. And when people are shut out, resentment festers, which is why 62% of Americans under 30 now say they have a positive view of one of history's most murderous economic systems, socialism. Worse than that, these aren't random cracks in civilization. They're the same fault lines that show up again and again throughout history right before societies collapse. Philosophers, historians, economists, the best minds across multiple eras all point to the same sequence. Debt accumulates, the middle class disappears, trust breaks down, populism rises, elites get overproduced, wealthy people hedge against collapse, and debt spirals wildly out of control until violence erupts. If you want to know where America is at on that timeline, we just crossed $37 trillion in government debt. That's more than $100,000 of debt for every man, woman, and child in the country. Only 18% of adults even earn that much in a year. The debt to GDP ratio is at a staggering 122% and climbing. And 130% is considered a red line over which virtually every country that has ever spent any meaningful amount of time above that line has collapsed. History is screaming at us. The dashboard is flashing red. If we do not take evasive action immediately, if you can't afford a bunker in New Zealand, your future is going to be bleak. Today, we're going to speed run how countries collapse so we can see exactly what we need to do to avoid it. And if we can't avoid it as a society, what you personally need to do to make it to the other side better than before the collapse. Because collapses always hurt most people, but they also always help a select few. We're going to cover this in 5 easy parts. Part 5 is the playbook, but you are not going to want to skip part 4 because if you do, you're going to be in trouble. It won't make any sense because that's where I explain why the answer you're currently being sold isn't going to work, at least not alone. So welcome to part 1, the anatomy of a collapse. In the last years of the USSR, grocery store shelves were so bare that by 1990, the average Soviet family spent 1/3 of their income on food when it was available, and still faced chronic shortages. Within a year, the empire was gone. When Argentina defaulted on its debt in 2001, poverty doubled in just 6 months. Riots spread so fast that the country cycled through 5 presidents in 2 weeks. In 1923, debt crushed Germany so hard they had to hyperinflate their currency just to try to survive. And at one point, it took 4.2 trillion German marks to buy a single US dollar. That was the collapse that paved the way for Hitler. Now, I encourage you guys to self-radicalize by researching how often countries actually fail. It's not just the Roman Empire, despite all the memes. It's happened over and over. And for better or worse, history shows that when it comes to economies, countries don't collapse randomly. They follow a pattern you're gonna find distressingly familiar to things you see happening today. But before I break it down, let's set some context. Most people just wanna live their lives. They wanna fall in love, make some money, raise a family, and have a little bit of fun. But to do that, they need a few things, namely a stable government, law and order, personal property rights, affordable basics, a growing economy, equal opportunity, and community trust. You mess with that nice and simple list at your peril. It is the ultimate FAFO, because breaking any one of those things, let alone a lot of them, and we go from a species that can cooperate in unparalleled fashion to a homicidal or even genocidal species real fast. As Alfred Henry Lewis said back in 1906, there are only 9 meals between mankind and revolution. if supermarkets stopped being supplied within 3 days, people would panic and social order would start breaking down. The question is then, what causes grocery stores to stop getting stocked? Unfortunately, history has a ready-made answer for us. It starts with currency debasement. Governments spend well beyond their means, debts pile up, and the fastest way to paper over the shortfalls is to print more money. Rome debased its silver denarius until it was made of only 0.02% silver. That's the same thing we're doing to the dollar, by the way. It's just hard to notice because the dollar looks and feels the same, but it spends like the 0.02% silver denarius or the Weimar Germany mark. Governments just keep lowering its value until the people revolt because they can't afford anything anymore. As a currency is inflated away, like we're doing right now, the middle class begins to disappear. When most people can no longer afford the basics, a home, groceries, education, and yet the ultra-wealthy have Cirque du Soleil performers at their weddings, resentment starts to boil. Next is populism. As people en masse start going to hell in a handbasket, leaders rise up promising easy solutions, people to blame, and most gloriously of all, people to punish. Political scientist Cass Mudd calls populism a thin ideology. It doesn't solve problems, but it fuels people's anger and gives them someone to hate. And that feels a lot better than hopelessness. But in the fullness of time, history proves that populism only accelerates the fall if it's left uninterrupted. Next is the cultural breakdown. As debt spirals, the middle class disappears and resentment skyrockets, shared identity erodes and trust collapses. Robert Putnam showed this in Bowling Alone. When social capital disappears, communities fragment. Pew's latest data shows that only 22% of Americans trust their government. We are in the late innings, folks. The next thing that happens is truly bizarre. As soon as I say it, you're gonna get it. But if you're anything like me, it is so obvious, it's invisible. It's what Peter Turchin calls elite overproduction. This is where way too many credentialed elites are chasing too few elite slots. We're going to talk more about that later, but it is a very important idea that goes something like this. You got too many lawyers, academics, financiers, and political types for the available demand. And while regular people struggle and the number of people dying from opiate addiction goes way up, the result? Infighting at the top, resentment at the bottom, and a ghost town in the middle as the middle class is torn in two. Half going up to the upper class because they own assets, and half going down because they don't. As a side note, assets are the only thing that protect you from the negative impact of inflation. But 10% of Americans own 93% of the assets. And finally, we get the elites hedging against collapse. Ray Dalio is one of my favorite people on planet Earth, but it was a surreal experience bumping into him backstage at a conference in Dubai that we were both speaking at, and I realized, oh yeah, this is exactly what people mean when they say that money will move to wherever it's stable. Wealthy people will get their money out. Barring becoming a tyrannical government that imprisons its own citizens, there's no way to stop it. They will move assets offshore. They will build their companies elsewhere. They will buy bunkers in New Zealand. And all of that will reduce the tax base, and that will force the government to print more money because no one votes for the politician who says we need to spend less. And that's how it happens. That's why this cycle repeats. It's what happened in Rome, in the Ottoman Empire, in France before the Revolution, in Weimar Germany before the rise of fascism, in the Soviet Union before it dissolved, in Argentina after World War I, in Argentina again when Perón got elected, and Argentina again in 2001. It's what happened in Zimbabwe, in Venezuela, in Greece during the Eurozone crisis. And those are just the famous ones. And now, all of the signals are lighting up that America is in the same dangerous position. Currency debasement, a rapidly disappearing middle class, housing prices make homes out of reach for the vast majority of people. Populism is on the rise, cultural cohesion is breaking down, there is massive elite overproduction, the wealthy are hedging, and under it all, the debt spiral is tightening like a noose. This is the anatomy of a collapse, and we're living it right now. But there is a way to avoid it. But before we can get to that, you have to understand why this situation is so dangerous and difficult to stop. So welcome to part 2. How do you stop a country from bleeding to death? I want you to imagine a car pins someone against a wall. The collision crushes the person's blood vessels so badly that they should be dead, but that same pressure also seals the wound shut and keeps them alive. This is a real phenomenon trauma doctors call the tamponade effect. The patient will often remain conscious, talking, sometimes even able to call a loved one to say goodbye, but the moment rescuers pull the car away, the seal is gone, and the person is likely going to bleed to death almost instantaneously. For this reason, EMS teams are trained never to remove an impaling object or release pressure in the field because it almost always results in immediate death. It's brutal, but it happens way more often than we want to think. And it's the perfect metaphor for America's economy right now. We are accumulating debt so rapidly that barring extreme intervention, we are going to go bankrupt, the equivalent of bleeding to death. We'll try to tax the rich, but they'll leave. Then we'll try to tax the middle class, but they're already broke because the wealthy will have taken the jobs with them when they're overtaxed. And that only leaves money printing. And that's the same as pulling the car back and letting the patient bleed to death. The money will hyperinflate, the government will be forced to default on its debt, and just like that, you're Argentina, a once great country that no one trusts anymore. And that's when you realize that when your money isn't backed by gold, or anything else for that matter, all you have is trust. And when that's gone, it's game over. The reason this is so terrifying is because once the cycle begins, it behaves like a positive feedback loop. The worse it gets, the faster it accelerates. Each step in the process making it harder and harder to reverse course. Debt is not inert, it compounds. And compounding doesn't just add pressure, it multiplies it until there's nothing left to spend money on other than the interest payments. Here's exactly how it unfolds. At first, governments try to do the obvious thing, tax the rich. But high net worth individuals are the most mobile people on the planet. They have lawyers, accountants, and second passports ready to go. Don't believe me? It's happening right now. According to Henley and Partners, a record 142,000 millionaires are projected to relocate in 2025. The UK alone is set to lose more than 9,000 millionaires just this year, one of the worst outflows in the world ever recorded. Where are they going? To countries with stronger property right protections like the UAE, Singapore, and the US itself. It's proof that capital doesn't wait around to be confiscated. It flees. That forces the government to shift the burden down a rung. Next, they turn to the middle class. If we've got any fans of the Nordic countries, this one's for you. Taxing the life out of the middle class is exactly how they're able to have such a burdensome welfare state. But here's the problem for the US. The middle class is already drowning. Household debt in America has just crossed $17.7 trillion, with credit card balances hitting a record $1.3 trillion in 2024. We don't just have a government debt problem. We have corporate debt and individual debt as well. The average American household now pays over $1,200 a year just in credit card interest payments. You can't squeeze blood from a stone, and when you try, all you do is accelerate defaults, bankruptcies, and resentment. With the rich gone and the middle class tapped out, governments are left with only one option: print money. And this is how the noose tightens around our collective necks. With each dollar they print, every dollar becomes worth less. Unfortunately, there's no such thing as an infinite money glitch. Wish there was, but there's not. If you print money, inflation will rise. If inflation goes up, interest rates go up, which makes debt more expensive to service, which leads to more money printing so the government doesn't have to default on its loans. But by hyperinflating the currency, it defaults nonetheless. They may give you the promised dollars, but the promised dollars are now worthless. It's known as a debt-death spiral, and it's the same death spiral that killed all the countries I listed before. And it's not just a domestic problem. Foreign creditors will inevitably notice. In fact, in the case of the US, they already have. Both China and Japan, the two biggest holders of US debt, have been steadily reducing their exposure as a vote of no confidence. China's holdings have fallen to their lowest level since 2009. They've trimmed more than $500 billion in the last decade. Once foreign investors lose faith, yields spike in an attempt to attract investors to buy our debt. Perversely though, this sends our own interest payments to the moon and we all get to watch as that sends the debt curve vertical. That's when it becomes mathematically impossible to ever pay the debt back. Despite that, as borrowing costs explode, governments will do what they always do: borrow even more money. In the US, our debt already exceeds our GDP. We're never going to pay it back, at least not all of it. And interest payments on the debt have already hit $1 trillion annually, more than the entire defense budget. That's correct. We are now spending more to service our debt than we do to protect our country. It all sounds so ridiculous, but it's also all true. And this debt death spiral happens all the time. It just hasn't happened in our lifetimes here in the US. As legendary investor Ray Dalio is very fond of saying, just because it hasn't happened in your lifetime doesn't mean it's not common. And here's the kicker. Once trust is gone, it's usually gone for a very long time. Even just looking at Argentina's most recent collapse in 2001. Within 6 months, as I said, poverty doubled. 5 presidents fell in just 2 weeks. People did not wait around for reform. They stormed banks and looted grocery stores. Once faith in the money dies, society doesn't adjust, it revolts. That's the loop. Debt leads to taxation. Taxation drives out capital. That hollows out the middle class. That forces money printing. Money printing destroys trust, and once trust is gone, collapse accelerates into free fall. Unless you interrupt it with radical, painful course corrections, it feeds itself like a chain reaction. Honestly, I miss the days when I didn't understand any of this, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And right now, as a country anyway, we only have one option remaining. But before I can explain that, I've got one more hard truth I have to lay out. So welcome to part 3. Countries always collapse from within. A University of Chicago survey found that 1 in 4 Americans now believe violence against the government may be justified. And in June, proving the polls correct, a man impersonating a police officer carried out a politically motivated killing spree, assassinating former Minnesota House Speaker Melissa Hortman and her husband, and then shooting State Senator John Hoffman and his wife in their home. It was the most concentrated political violence against state legislators in modern US history. But it isn't just the people versus the government anymore. It's the people versus each other. Pew Research finds that 2/3 of Americans now say the other political party is not just wrong, but a serious threat to the nation's survival. That's the level of polarization that doesn't end in debate, it ends in bloodshed. Additionally, half the country believes political elites are corrupt, and researchers have shown that belief directly fuels openness to violence. According to Pew, among gun owners, 72% say protection is the primary reason they own a firearm, far above hunting or sport. Layer on top of that the fact that nearly half of Americans report feeling persistently isolated, and what you're witnessing is the collapse of the very fabric we're counting on to hold society together. And that's the rub. In nearly every collapsing empire, the story is the same. Debt piles up, taxes soar, the wealthy flee, the money is debased to deal with the debt, and the culture fractures. This loop is going to be very familiar by the end because it's a feedback loop that tears society apart from the inside over and over and over. Peter Turchin saw this coming long before it hit the headlines because it's so predictable. Back in 2010, he published research predicting that the 2020s would be a period of severe instability in America. That was a decade before the pandemic, the riots, and the political assassinations. And in 2020, alongside Jack Goldstone, he doubled down in an essay titled "Welcome to the Turbulent 20s," warning that the US was entering its most vulnerable phase in over a century. What did he see looping through history that made him believe a decade in advance we'd be living through what we're living through now? We'll get back to the show in just a second, but first, let's talk about where serious traders go. Most people pick crypto exchanges based on marketing budgets, not track records, so you end up on platforms built for marketing, not trading. While you're getting bombarded with flashy ads and celebrity endorsements, serious traders have been quietly using Kraken for 13 years. This is the only exchange that's actually listed on Bloomberg Terminal. Williams Formula One does not partner with amateurs, and neither does Tottenham. These brands stake their reputation on who they work with. They choose Kraken because when real money is on the line, you don't want an app with the best commercials. You want the platform that actually holds what they say they hold. Kraken publishes their books, complete transparency about your assets. Most exchanges won't even tell you if your money is really there. Kraken shows you the proof. So stop following the crowd. Trade where transparency actually matters. Click the link in the description right now and start trading like you mean it. This is a paid advertisement. This content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. And now let's get back to the show. He saw that when the economy buckles, the strain doesn't stop at the ledger. It pulls at the very threads of identity and community until the country starts consuming itself from within. Writing in Nature in 2010, he said flatly, the next decade is likely to be a period of growing instability in the United States and Western Europe. Certainly nailed that. He was flagging a rising instability signal built from long-running data. And a decade later, he and Andrei Korolev published a retrospective in PLOS One, showing that, exactly as forecast, riots and mass demonstrations surged throughout the 2010s. His predictions weren't headline tracking. They came from a framework he calls Structural Demographic Theory, or SDT for short. Originally formalized by Jack Goldstone and further developed by Turchin, SDT models how three slow-moving pressures build until they break a society. 1, intra-elite competition. 2, populist economic squeeze. And 3, state fiscal stress. Turchin operationalizes these in a composite political stress indicator he calls PSI. When PSI rises and stays high, instability is guaranteed to follow. Here's what each of the individual pressures means in practice and how they're measured in the SDT model. 1, elite overproduction. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is when too many elite aspirants are chasing too few elite slots. This rises when elite incomes fall relative to GDP per person and when the number of elites seeking elite positions is higher than the number of elite positions available. Think credential inflation, more degrees, more lawyers, MBAs, power track grads. That combo amplifies factional conflict at the top. Patronage wars, hardball politics, and splintering coalitions are going to ensue. 2, immiseration and mass mobilization potential. This is the ground level financial squeeze when worker wages lag GDP per person, a relative fall in wages, when urbanization concentrates the discontented, and when youth cohorts are large, a youth bulge, societies get way more combustible. In the model, this pressure rises with the inverse of the relative wage. Simply put, living conditions get worse because the middle class is getting cleaned out due to things like globalization. Mechanically, lower relative wages increase the pressure and creates more people with both the motive and, due to urbanization, the proximity to each other to organize and mobilize out of anger. 3, state fiscal distress. As the debt to GDP climbs and trust in institutions fall, the state loses room to buy calm, let's say, via stimulus, and loses the trust we were talking about earlier that is so critical to fiat currencies that are backed by nothing. Fiscal pressure then rises as the debt burden rises and distrust rises. High debt and low trust is a deadly combo. According to Turchin, these 3 pressures aren't additive, they're multiplicative. And that multiplicity is exactly how societies break. Each pressure source amplifies the other massively. Crowded elites times squeezed households times a fiscally strained government yields a setup where every shock hits harder and every policy fight turns existential. Sound familiar? That's the math behind Turchin's 2010 prediction and exactly what we're living through right now. Turchin argued that all 3 pressures turned on in the 1970s and climbed for decades, putting the PSI on course to spike around, you guessed it, 2020. His genius wasn't predicting which spark would start our problems. It was showing that the kindling was in place and would catch fire when any spark came along. Bottom line is, Turchin's thesis wasn't that there was a big event coming. It was that the structural elements were and are in place for a big problem. Too many elites, too hard of a financial squeeze on households, and a state way too indebted and distrusted to absorb the inevitable shocks. Once those three align, instability is a guarantee. Now, I wish I could stop there, but we haven't yet dealt with populism. Ronald Inglehart and Pippa Norris showed in their research that populism rises not just from economic collapse, but also from the fear that society itself is changing too fast. In the age of AI and open borders, can you imagine? Economic anxiety plus cultural anxiety is the recipe that fuels populism. And unfortunately, populism doesn't solve problems, it just points fingers. It says the pure and good people are being betrayed by the corrupt elite. And in difficult moments, that message spreads like wildfire because it gives people someone to hate. That's exactly what you see with immigration. To oversimplify a very complicated issue, as globalism soars and nations weaken, the government throws open the borders out of guilt and demographic needs, which burdens institutions and infrastructure and forces the further accumulation of additional debt. Additionally, capitalists further weaken the middle class by importing cheap labor, employing illegals, and offshoring manufacturing, all to lower costs. This weakens employee bargaining power and eliminates many high-paying blue-collar jobs. This additional financial strain, coupled with an easily identifiable other for right-wing populists, for example, to hate, and you have a recipe for disaster. Rome flooded itself with outsiders in its final years. Europe nearly tore itself apart during the migrant crisis of 2015 and is still dealing with the cultural backlash that comes with importing far too many people far too quickly. And now, in America, after 4 years of effectively wide open borders, the left and the right are tearing at each other over how to handle the issue. Success creates guilt, and guilt creates overgenerosity. But as all empires must apparently learn the hard way, success is not a law of nature. If you make bad decisions, you will get a bad outcome. Just ask England, for whom at one point the sun never set on their empire, and now they're back to being a small island country off the coast of Europe. The hard truth is, economic prosperity is fragile, and when its fruits are shared carelessly, it collapses under the weight of expectation-driven debt. We all wish that weren't true, but it is true. And finally, you get the breakdown of identity itself. As I mentioned earlier, Robert Putnam warned about this decades ago in Bowling Alone. When trust collapses, when people no longer feel they're part of a shared national project, the nation itself stops being a nation and reverts back to a rough collection of factions. The latest Pew data makes it abundantly clear. Trust in government is circling the drain. And once trust is gone, cooperation is gone. And when cooperation disappears, violence is all that's left. And that's what Ray Dalio, and many others quite honestly, note is the hallmark of the big debt cycle, internal conflict. But make no mistake, it's the big debt cycle that has the patient pinned to the tree. It's the debt that's crushing people. But simply defaulting or forgiving the debt is like backing up the car. And in the world's strangest twist of fate, that's exactly how you kill the patient in no time flat. So where do we go from here if we're pinned up against a tree? Welcome to part 4. Everyone eventually gets mugged by reality. A recent survey found that 62% of Americans under 30 now view socialism favorably. The Democratic Socialists of America are booming. Their 2025 National Convention in Chicago drew tens of thousands and underscored the movement's growing political muscle. In city after city, DSA-backed candidates are winning. That girth of support looks like legitimate grassroots growth, not a passing phase, much to my dismay, because the bad news, socialism doesn't work. And socialist regimes don't fail from an overabundance of goodwill towards all, as some may want to think. They all collapse due to violence. According to esteemed author and political scientist R.J. Rummel, regimes claiming to be socialist and/or communist have killed over, get ready for it, 260 million of their own citizens in the 20th century alone. Why? Because socialism promises things for free, attempts to confiscate the means of production, and evenly distribute the proceeds to the workers. It completely eliminates the free market and destroys pricing signals, however. A move that ironically leads to shortages, corruptions, black markets, and crazy prices. Eventually, people's cooperation can only be obtained at the end of a gun barrel, And that has a way of disincentivizing them. Even the Chinese Communist Party had to resort to good old-fashioned capitalism to stop starving its people to death. The evidence is overwhelming. Every time socialism is tried, it begins with promises of equality and ends with poverty and repression. The free market isn't just a bunch of greedy capitalists setting prices to make themselves rich. The reason that it survives, the reason that it works as well as it does, is because the free market is a form of distributed collective intelligence. It uncovers what people actually want, what they need, what's scarce, what's abundant, and what things should cost. Take that away and you end up with things at a price no one will pay, shelves full of things no one wants, and/or nothing of what people desperately need. That's exactly what happened in the Soviet Union. The state controlled all production, but without pricing signals, planners had no way to allocate resources efficiently. So you'd have warehouses overflowing with shoes that don't fit, while grocery stores sat empty. The black market became the only place to get goods that people actually needed at a price they were willing to pay. Basically, the black market was the free market, just illegal. Venezuela, same thing. Once one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America, thanks to its oil, but absolutely destroyed by socialist policies. Price controls, like the ones Kamala Harris promised and Mamdani is promising now, led to chronic shortages, inflation to skyrocket into the thousands of percent, and forced millions to flee the country to escape hunger and violence. And then there's the aforementioned China, the most important case of all. For decades, Mao's experiments with socialist economics starved tens of millions of Chinese people to death. It wasn't until Deng Xiaoping introduced capitalist reforms in 1978, opening up markets, allowing private enterprise, and even encouraging foreign investment, that China began lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It was the single most successful poverty reduction program in human history, and it didn't come from socialism, it came from rejecting it. It was capitalism with Chinese characteristics, as they would say. The pattern is always the same. Socialism sounds compassionate, but in practice, it's driven by envy for reasons I've covered here in a previous video. And it requires coercion. Once people realize that their incentives for working hard are gone, they stop producing, and governments are forced to compel them with the threat of violence. Cooperation breaks down, productivity collapses, and the system spirals into authoritarianism and mass death. So what does that leave? Growth. That's the playbook that's being run by the current administration. Grow your way out of the problem. That's certainly part of a sane solution, but the reality is that the growth is all you need mantra is not going to work. Why not? First of all, it's too late. We're already sitting on $37 trillion in debt. Even if you solve that problem though, by some miracle, there's still corporate debt and personal debt to deal with. It's just too much by historical standards to naturally grow your way out from under. Barring AI ushering in a once-in-history productivity miracle, there's no plausible level of growth that can outpace the compounding debt curve. Between new debt and the compounding interest on the existing debt, the spiral is just too aggressive. In the last 2 years alone, the US added $1 trillion in new debt every 100 days. You don't outrun that with 3% GDP growth, which is what we've averaged. Without severe austerity measures, you'd need roughly 7% GDP growth just to stop the spiral from accelerating. More if you want to actually lower our debt to GDP ratio. To hit just 90% debt to GDP ratio, you'd need a sustained decade of about 8% growth. And the last time we did that was in the 1970s. And bad news, inflation was so high that despite 8% GDP growth, it was still considered a recession in real terms, so that wouldn't work. Second, even if we did somehow grow our way out of the debt, we'd still be left with catastrophic inequality. Right now, the top 10% of Americans own 93% of all financial assets. The middle class is locked out of housing, the one asset they intuitively understand, and rents are devouring their paychecks. Growth, on its own, just does not fix that. In fact, history shows it usually makes it worse. When the system is tilted, new wealth flows to the people who already own the assets. GDP might rise, but resentment rises faster. And when resentment metastasizes, societies crack, regardless of what the headline growth number says. Third, growth is blind. It doesn't know who it helps. The last 40 years prove that. Globalization and technology produce staggering growth, trillions in new wealth. But the spoils went overwhelmingly to the top, while the middle class was hollowed out and entire regions were left behind. Growth didn't heal America's divides, it deepened them. Without structural reform, more growth just accelerates the exact same fractures we've already talked about. Put it all together, and that's why Ray Dalio says the only real way forward is what he calls a beautiful deleveraging, which is a nice way of saying do something so hard, basically nobody's going to do it. It's a very, very delicate mix of spending cuts, austerity, debt restructuring, wealth transfers, and money printing. The goal being to avoid violent revolution and reduce the debt burden without breaking the economy, all while laying down a path to future growth that doesn't blow up inflation. If it sounds hard, it's because it is. It is painful, and it requires an amount of cooperation I am frankly completely unconvinced we are capable of in a moment where socialism is gaining in popularity. So no, there are no easy, free stuff for everyone or just growth solutions that are before us. Growth is necessary, wealth redistribution is necessary, but in isolation, none of it is sufficient. The pressure from the debt spiral, the wealth gap, and the trust collapse will continue to increase until something explodes. So if we're going to make it through this, we need more than platitudes. We need a real playbook. So welcome to Part 5, the Playbook, aka How to Win in Wild Times. From 2020 to 2022, as the world reeled from a pandemic, nearly $42 trillion in new wealth was created. That wasn't over a decade. That was in just 2 years. It was the single fastest wealth surge in human history, forged not in stability, but in collapse. And history shows, as much as this makes me sick to my stomach, that's just how it works. When economies crack, most get crushed, but a select few are gonna come out way better than ever. Rockefeller made the bulk of his fortune during the Panic of 1873. The Rothschilds capitalized on devastating European wars. Walter Chrysler nearly tripled his company's market share in the depths of the Great Depression. George Soros made a cool $1 billion in a single day betting against the British pound. John Paulson made $15 billion betting against the housing market as millions were foreclosed on. Michael Burry, the real Big Short guy, also made nearly $1 billion for the same reason. The list goes on and on. Again and again, collapses destroy most people, but they make fortunes for the prepared few. So the question isn't whether collapse is coming. The question is, are you going to be one of the few who comes out better than you went in? Now, I doubt any of us are going to make billions off of hard times. That's not my pitch. That takes a lot of capital to make concentrated bets, a rare financial mind who can bet against the consensus and be right, and the cojones to stick with a plan in the midst of massive uncertainty, especially around timing. I don't expect that even of myself, but I do want to be prepared to weather any storm and come out on the other side better, even if I hedge my bets and diversify my risk like a chicken. That brings us to the playbook. Step 1, get into assets. Assets are the dividing line between the rich and the poor. It's that simple. It's that simple. Get the bulk of your savings into a smart basket of assets. If you sit in cash, inflation will silently bleed you dry. In the last century alone, the US dollar lost over 90% of its purchasing power. 90%, 9-0. During the stagflation of the 1970s, gold, an asset, didn't just hold steady in price, it exploded from $35 an ounce in 1971 to $850 an ounce in 1980. Commodities like oil also surged 400%, protecting wealth, while paper money was torched. Even in simple equities, like in the stock market, the pattern is clear. A Yale study of historical returns found that over 200 years, stocks have returned an average of 6.5% after inflation, while cash just loses value. Assets are how the rich get richer, and not having them is how the poor get poorer. Everyone is affected by inflation, but only assets offer you any protection. Step 2, stay mobile. In moments of collapse, your ability to move to a region that is stable could be the difference between safety and ruin. The goal is to find a jurisdiction that is capital friendly, high in financial freedom, tax efficient, and safe. These are the places that are likely to grow and are exactly where you want to be in times of turmoil. You do not want to be geographically trapped somewhere that is attempting to plunder the wealthy, as that is a sure sign that the economy is going to grind to a halt and open violence is right around the corner. Here's what the wealthy know. Capital doesn't wait to be confiscated. It moves to safety. After India's emergency in the 1970s, tens of thousands of wealthy Indians emigrated, taking capital and talent to London, Dubai, and Singapore. After Argentina's 2001 collapse, an estimated 200,000 citizens fled the country within just 2 years. And as mentioned earlier, right now, millionaires are relocating around the world in literal record-setting numbers. I hope that tells you something. Step 3, choose business-friendly environments. Where business is punished, collapse accelerates. Where business is protected, no matter how much people hate it, the drivers of prosperity, namely entrepreneurship and innovation, remain possible. In times of trouble, figure out where safety reigns, people are good to each other, and the populace is respectful of the physics of money. Go there. Those locations will have strong economies and be the bastions of growth and opportunity. In the 2025 Heritage Foundation Economic Freedom Index, Singapore, Switzerland, and Ireland top the list. Compare that to Venezuela, which ranks near the bottom. The same Venezuela, where GDP has collapsed by over 75% since 2013 under socialist controls. And in the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index, Denmark, Norway, and Finland lead the world. Nations where contracts are enforced, corruption is minimal, and property rights are sacred. By contrast, countries at the bottom, like Zimbabwe and Afghanistan, are the same places where citizens have seen their savings wiped out by inflation or just outright confiscation. Guys, the pattern is simple. Where businesses thrive, people thrive. Kill business and you kill your entire economy, and rapidly, your nation as a whole. Step 4, invest in your skills. Assets can be seized, as I like to remind Bitcoin owners. Money can be devalued. Businesses can be regulated to death. But there's one thing no collapse can take from you: your skills. In 2023, Georgetown University found that college graduates earn 84% more over their lifetime than high school graduates. And technical skills amplify that even more. A licensed electrician in the US today can command $85 to $120 an hour, while software engineers with AI expertise are seeing starting salaries north of $180,000. And don't forget, the world's best AI engineers are capable of commanding billion-dollar salaries. That's pure insanity and speaks to the power of the right skill set at the right time. You can also look at Cuba. After Castro's revolution, tens of thousands of professionals fled to Miami. Within a decade, Cuban Americans own nearly 40% of Miami's small businesses. They lost everything they had in Cuba, but carried their skills to a new location, and that was enough for them to rebuild fortunes quickly. If you want the safest hedge against collapse, it's not gold or real estate, it's you. Your skills, your family's skills, and the value you can create within a healthy economic system. Step 5, build parallel systems. Look, this one is the most radical step, and I considered not including it, but in the interest of leaving no stone unturned, for those of you who cannot remain mobile or who are just so inclined, consider creating alternate economic systems. During Argentina's 2001 collapse, more than 7 million people joined barter clubs, creating a shadow economy where groceries and services were exchanged without pesos. In Weimar, Germany, entire towns resorted to scrip and foreign currencies to get around the worthless German marks. And today, as trust in governments and banks wane, decentralized finance and crypto networks have surged. It should come as no surprise. In 2021, global crypto adoption rose by over 880% year on year, largely in nations battling inflation and capital controls. People always find a way. P.S. Research crypto. Even though, yes, with enough violence, the government can seize it from you, I'm a big believer in Bitcoin. This is a less controversial take, obviously, by the day, but it's still something you'll need to form your own opinion about. Now, building parallel systems does not mean you have to go off-grid tomorrow, or even that you need to build the system yourself. You can simply avail yourself of the alternate system if it comes to that. Start by looking at crypto as a good alternative system that has already gained relatively large adoption. Just know that if big systems do in fact wobble, there are still options at your disposal. Don't allow yourself to feel hopeless. I know this idea is pretty radical, but history is clear. Those who cling to failing systems past their expiration date are going to get crushed. Those who adapt to whatever circumstances present themselves at least have a much higher likelihood of survival. And now is the time to adapt. The economic and social signals that warn of potential collapse are flashing all red. Every empire that collapses follows a similar pattern, and America is not immune. First, debt accumulates, then money's printed, then inflation destroys the middle class, then polarization skyrockets and trust evaporates. Populism rises, everyone joins a team, and fights like their lives depend on it. Taxes are weaponized, and ultimately the wealthy flee or simply stop producing, and the economy collapses, taking the country's stability with it. That script is very familiar to anybody paying attention to history. It plays out over and over again. The ways to avoid it are well documented, but also almost never heeded. So, if we can't save everyone, at least we can try and save the ones we love and hope that it ripples out from there. And remember, while a collapse destroys most people, it also creates a massive opportunity for a select few who adapt, who prepare, and who refuse to be victims. History never forgives the unprepared, but it always rewards those who see the collapse coming and take action. If you want to join me as I explore topics like this live, make sure to join me on YouTube, where you can heckle me, join in on the discussion, or just watch the most entertaining and useful show on YouTube. I hope I'll see you guys there live Wednesday and Friday mornings at 6 a.m. Pacific time. Until then, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace.
If you like this conversation, check out this episode to learn more.
In the late 90s, the internet minted millionaires at a speed no one had ever seen before. By 1999, 7,000 new millionaires were being created every week.